This is section C from our last unit, that is health promotion. If you have a look at this section, this says individual factors in changing health beliefs. And the first, let's have a look at the syllabus first. This is how the syllabus looks like. We need to take into account these three studies that we have over here. Number one, we need to understand what unrealistic optimism is. Number two, we talk about trans theoretical model. And number three, we talk about health change in adolescence. We have three different studies that we would be discussing, keeping in mind these three topics: unrealistic optimism, trans theoretical model, and health change in adolescence. Getting back to the first one over here, the first thing that we'd be discussing here is unrealistic optimism. Now, the name pretty much reveals this, and when we talk about unrealistic optimism, we're actually talking about an error in judgment when we are unrealistically optimistic. In other words, when we tend to assume that something bad would not happen to us. In other words, the very popular example that I keep on giving about people in our country or people in general not wearing masks these days is because they think they would probably not have COVID, right? So this is a biased outcome that they're trying to look forward towards, right? So Weinstein in 1980 investigated unrealistic optimism about future life events. He classified unrealistic optimism as an error in judgment. Of course, it's an error in judgment, and this can be linked to your cognitive mechanisms, right? Where people tend to believe that they are invulnerable and expect others to be victims of misfortune and illness, not themselves. Now, there are several factors that Weinstein tried linking with this. If we discuss them one by one, number one, their desired end state. Like I had said a couple of minutes back, when you talk about desired end state, no one really imagines. I mean, back in the days when COVID just started in our country, where there was a lot of hype, where there was a lot of fear that people had back then, everyone was super cautious, super careful. I'm talking about people from the middle class background or above, right? Everyone was super cautious about being about having COVID, okay? But slowly and gradually, because somewhere in the mind, people probably did think of how one could probably die because of COVID, how the end state could be like, right? But today, with the pass of time, we have gotten desensitized and we have gotten over with it. The majority has, okay? So the factors that cause persons to be unrealistically biased or optimistically biased: number one, their desired end state. They do not imagine themselves dying out of COVID, probably. Number two, your cognitive mechanisms. It all has to do with your mind, like I had said earlier, an error in judgment. Number three, the information they had about themselves versus others. Now, people think they're usually cautious and careful with their behavior, and others, the ones who do not have, who have been through this, rather, who have been through COVID, they probably were not careful with themselves. So the amount of information, the type of information, the information that you have about yourself compared to the information that you have about others, that could again have its contribution towards you believing you'd have COVID, or you imagining yourself having COVID, right? Number four, your overall mood. If you're low, or if you have heard about someone else going through all of this, these unfortunate events, there's a possibility that might affect your mood, which might again result in a change in terms of how you perceive problems or how you perceive things to be, right? So we talking about unrealistic optimism. This study that is a part of a syllabus was conducted by Weinstein in the year 1980. What we discussed over here was how Weinstein investigated unrealistic optimism about future life events. He classified unrealistic optimism as an error in judgment, okay? Where people tend to believe that they are invulnerable and expect others to be victims of misfortune and illness, but not themselves. I hope this is clear to all. Is this?
Yes, sir. Clear.
Yes, sir.
Now, there were these six tests, hypotheses that were to be tested. This is the plural of hypothesis. Okay. Number one, people believe that negative events are less likely to happen to them than to others, right? Of course, no one really assumes, imagines themselves going through negative events as compared to the rest, right? So people believe that negative events are less likely to happen to them than to others, and they believe that positive events are more likely to happen to them than to others. That's more like a wish come true. We usually expecting more of good things coming our way and less of bad things coming our way. A very simple example, we'd if we've purchased a lottery, we'd be looking forward towards that lottery working out well for us, right? So that's just one example out of many. So we do expect positive events to happen to us more as compared to negative events to happen to us, ठीक है? हम ये expect नहीं कर रहे होते, या हम ये यूजुअली इमेजिन नहीं कर रहे होते कि गाड़ी गाड़ी चलते हुए हमारा एक्सीडेंट हो जाएगा, हम मर जाएंगे. इंस्टेड हम ये एक्सपेक्ट रादर हम ये एक्सपेक्ट जरूर करते हैं कि यार अगर हमने लॉटरी खरीदी तो हमारी लॉटरी निकलेगी. वन. नंबर टू, among negative events, the more undesirable the event, the stronger the tendency to believe that one's own chances are less than average. Now you could simply talk about smokers over here, for the ones who smoke, the very scary pack of the very scary picture that is there on the cigarette packets, right? You see, that's something bad, right? So what we're talking about is, when you talk about negative events, the more undesirable an event, the stronger the tendency is that we'd believe that there are less than average chances for that event to happen to us, or that bad thing to happen to us. Clear? However, among positive events now, let me highlight this one and this one. Okay. However, when we talk about positive events, the more desirable the event is, the stronger the tendency to believe that one's own chances are greater than average. For instance, a $100,000 lottery, right? 1 लाख डॉलर की लॉटरी निकलने की चांसेस, अगर वो 10,000 में से एक बंदे के निकलने की चांस होगा, तो भी हमें लग रहा होता है कि यार शायद हमारा निकला है. Do we get this? Summing it up, when you talk about negative events, expect it to be we expect ourselves to go through it, right? On, I mean, there's very less expectation that we have, or the chances are less than average for us to think कि हमारे साथ होगा. लेकिन अगर कोई पॉजिटिव इवेंट होता है तो हमारे पास हमारी टेंडेंसी टू बिलीव, टू अज्यूम, टू इमेजिन, टू एक्सपेक्ट, टू विश कि ये हमारे साथ होगा, वो ज़्यादा होते हैं. देर मोर देन एवरेज. Number three, the greater the perceived probability of an event, right? So we're talking about probability of an event. For instance, even when you talk about PCR tests, right? PCR tests, everyone knows what PCR tests are because of COVID these days. PCR test के अंदर probability क्या है आपके पास, कि अगर आप एवरेज पॉपुलेशन को देखते हैं तो कितने लोगों ने टेस्ट कराया, कितने लोगों में से कितनों का पॉजिटिव आया, कितनों का नेगेटिव आया, ठीक है? तो द ग्रेटर परसीव्ड प्रोबेबिलिटी ऑफ एन इवेंट, द स्ट्रॉन्गर द टेंडेंसी फॉर पीपल टू बिलीव दैट देयर ओन चांसेस आर ग्रेटर देन एवरेज, राइट? जब हम देख रहे होते हैं कि यार ओके फाइन, इफ देयर आर 10,000 people who are getting tested through PCR in a day, and out of these 10,000, let's just say God forbid 7,000 people, they are COVID positive and 3,000 are COVID negative, right? So over here, the probability is greater. When there's greater probability for us to assume that there would be more chance of us to have that particular problem would be greater. I hope you all get this, right? Now, number four, previous personal experience with an event, right? Previous personal experience with an event increases the likelihood that people will believe their own chances are greater than average, right? For someone to have had gone through something earlier, right? Because they've been through it, now they assume, they'd feel like there is more of possibility of them to have it again. Now the COVID example doesn't really work out well over here. It does and it does not. We could talk about any other example. For instance, if someone was overspeeding and had an accident, because they've already been through it, the possibility of them considering the option of them having it again would be greater than the rest, right? Number 5, the greater the perceived controllability of a negative event. कोई भी अगर नेगेटिव इवेंट है, उस नेगेटिव इवेंट को आप किस हद तक कंट्रोल कर सक रहे हो, राइट? द ग्रेटर द perceived controllability of a negative event, the greater the tendency for people to believe that their own chances are less than average. The greater the perceived controllability of a positive event, the greater the chance for people to believe that their own chances are greater than average. So this pretty much explains it all. The more control you have, or the more control it apparently looks like you have, the more chances there are that you'd assume that a good thing would happen to you and a bad thing might not happen to you, because again, because again it has to do with the amount of control you have. Get it? Now, the sixth and the last hypothesis over here. When there's a stereotype that exists of a particular type of a person to whom a negative event is likely to happen, people will tend to believe that their own chances are less than average. For instance, even when you talk about let's get back to the COVID example again. If we talk about, almost our entire nation was under the impression that older people tend to get affected by COVID more as compared to the younger lot. Okay, let's not talk about this being correct or incorrect, but because if I talk about the lot I belong to, middle aged people, or if I talk about teenagers like you, they were like, okay, fine. It usually affects older lot, and since we aren't really that old, it might not affect us. Hoga hoke khatam ho jayega, right? So when a stereotype, you know what the word stereotype means? When a label exists of a particular type of person, जब एक label होता है कि यार इस तरह के बंदे को ये affect करेगा, to whom a negative event is likely to happen. If you do not fall into the category, that particular category, you'd believe there are chances that you'd believe that your own chances are less than average for that to happen to you. Does everyone get these 6 points?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Everyone?
Yes,
Yes, sir.
If you have a look at the procedure of this, Weinstein ran two studies that examined whether college students have unrealistic optimism about future life events. Okay. We're talking about this hypothesis being tested on college students, number one. Now, the text that you see over here has is from your Cambridge endorsed book, right? And yeah, let's the your Cambridge endorsed book by Julia Russell. This text comes from there. Okay. Now, study number one. In this study, 258 college students had to estimate their own chances of experiencing 42 life events compared to their classmates. We're talking about 258 college students, them being asked about the possibility of different life events, them being asked to compare or to figure out the extent to which they think a particular life event is going to happen to them as compared to their classmates. Okay? They were both positive and negative life events, good things happening to them and bad things happening to them. Participants rated their own chances to be above average when the event was a positive one, own chances to be above average when the event was a positive one, but below average when the event was a negative one. Now, let me take this back to these 6 points that we have over here. What does this, I mean, what we read on the next slide, what do you think this can be linked to? The second point? Get it?
Yes, sir.
yes, sir.
Now, factors such as the degree of desirability, the perceived probability, the degree of desirability, the perceived probability of an event occurring, past personal experience, and perceived probability of an event occurring appeared to influence the optimistic bias. This is a repetition. Do we all understand this? All of these factors, it was
Yes, sir.
that they do end up affecting optimistic bias, in other words, individuals being more optimistic about themselves as compared to others, right? Moving on, study number two, students had to list what factors they thought influenced their chances of experiencing 8 future life events. When these lists were read by a second group of people, the amount of unrealistic optimism shown by the group for the same 8 life events even decreased significantly. Therefore, as soon as people began to compare their likelihood with others, perceives any optimistic biases reduce significantly. Now, did everyone understand this point? Did we all get this
No,
point?
so I didn't get why the optimistic bias reduced.
Because when you're comparing yourself with others, you like, okay, जिस तरीके से मुझे लग रहा है कि ये मुझे नहीं हो सकता, इसी तरीके से दूसरे को भी लग रहा है कि उसके साथ नहीं हो सकता, इवेंचुअली होगा कैसे? Because everyone thinks about something good happening to themselves. Get it?
Yes, sir.
Right? So, although all six hypotheses were supported, different factors appeared to govern responses to positive and negative events. For negative events, optimism and perceived controllability had an impact on participants' judgment. Where an event was judged to be controllable, let me highlight these important things over here. When an event was judged to be controllable, a stereotype existed in participants' minds of the kind of person to whom the event generally occurred. We can assume this person was seen to be at risk because he or she did not take any action to control the risk. ये वही बात हो गई जो the examples that I was giving a couple of minutes back. अगर किसी को कोविड हो तब आपको पता चलता, then be like, oh, that person was never careful and that person probably was more uh, that person probably got what he got because of his own what do you call it choice of not taking preventive measures. We can assume this person was seen to be at risk because he or she did not take any action to control the risk. Participants seem to compare themselves with the stereotypical victim, leading them to decide that their own risks were less than average. Right? वही बात हो गई, the example that I've given. हम देखते हैं कि यार ओके कोविड बढ़ रहा है लेकिन ज़्यादा इफेक्ट तो बूढ़े लोगों को कर रहा है, हम अभी इतने बूढ़े नहीं हुए तो प्रॉब्लली अब हमें कोविड नहीं शायद हो, या अगर हमें होता है तो हमें शायद उस तरीके से कोविड अफेक्ट ना करे. For events perceived to be uncontrollable, there was no stereotype of the victim, and subjects did not show any systematic bias towards it. So, all of these six hypotheses, they were supported, but there were several factors, there were different factors that appeared to govern responses to positive and negative events. I hope this study that was conducted by Weinstein in the year 1980 is clear. This was from the section Individual Factors in Changing Health Beliefs. This happens to be the third and the last section from our last unit from health psychology, that is health promotion. Does anyone have any questions?
No,
No, sir.
All right, let's call it an off. And